The silver shuttle pierced the amber clouds of Ardanis, descending toward a city of broken spires and smoldering factories. From the viewport, Envoy Commander Selene Morrow watched Velsara's skyline materialize through the haze, ornate towers jutting like accusing fingers beside the crumbling industrial complexes. Only weeks had passed since the United Federation Peace Corps had broken the Octavian Syndicate's iron grip on this world. The scars remained fresh, visible even from orbit. "Final approach to Landing Zone Alpha," announced the pilot, "receiving clearance from ground control." Selene nodded, smoothing her blue UFPC uniform. The silver insignia at her shoulder, a broken chain encircled by stars, caught the artificial light. A symbol of liberation, of promise. She had requested this assignment specifically, convinced that Ardanis would become the model for post-syndicate transitions throughout the sector. After years analyzing policy from behind a desk, she would finally witness freedom blossom firsthand. The shuttle jostled as it touched down on a recently cleared landing pad. Beyond the reinforced windows, a delegation waited, a mix of UFPC officers in crisp uniforms and local Ardanans in varied garb that reflected their former castes. Some wore tattered industrial coveralls. Others sported the intricate embroidery of the artisan class. All wore expressions that oscillated between hope and wariness. "Commander Morrow," greeted Governor Lynthia Farr as Selene descended the ramp. The older woman's tight smile betrayed the strain of the past weeks. "Welcome to Velsara. We've prepared briefings on our progress." "I'm eager to see it," Selene replied, clasping the governor's hand firmly. "The Federation Council considers Ardanis our most promising liberation effort to date." Governor Farr's smile thinned. "Yes. Well, promising doesn't mean simple." She gestured to a tall, broad-shouldered man, standing slightly apart from the others. "This is Elias Koran. He's been invaluable as our liaison to the local population." Elias stepped forward, his movements fluid, yet cautious. His face bore the unmistakable scar of a syndicate enforcer, a thin line that curved from temple to jaw. His gaze met Selene's without flinching, but there was something unreadable in his dark eyes. "Commander," his voice was deep, deliberate, "I hope your journey was uneventful." "It was. Thank you." Selene studied him, noting the way he carried himself, straight-backed, vigilant, a man accustomed to authority, yet now operating in its shadows. "I understand you've been helping our transition teams navigate local customs." "I try." His response was measured. "There are complexities to Ardanis that may not be immediately apparent." Before Selene could inquire further, Governor Farr intervened. "Let's continue this at headquarters. We have much to cover before tomorrow's council meeting." The convoy traversed the city's central thoroughfare, providing Selene her first ground-level glimpse of liberation's aftermath. Velsara was a study in contrasts. Freshly painted UFPC banners proclaiming "Chains broken, choice awaits" hung alongside buildings, still bearing the geometric insignia of the syndicate. Citizens filled the streets, some engaged in rebuilding efforts, others gathered in small groups, their conversations halting whenever UFPC vehicles passed. What struck Selene most was not the physical destruction. She had expected that, but rather the uncertain rhythm of the city, as if Velsara itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what freedom truly meant. The provisional headquarters had been established in what was once the Syndicate's regional administration building, a towering structure of gleaming obsidian and steel. Inside, the clinical efficiency of the UFPC operation was in full evidence. Officers manned communication stations. Holographic maps displayed ongoing relief efforts, and the walls were adorned with the faces of newly appointed council members from various former castes. "We've made significant progress," Governor Farr explained, as she led Selene through the command center. "Markets have reopened. We've initiated public education programs. and the Provisional Council meets daily to address community needs. And citizen response? Celine inquired. A brief hesitation. Largely positive. There are pockets of resistance. Of course, change is never universally embraced, but our surveys indicate strong support for the liberation effort. Celine caught Elias's subtle shift in posture, a nearly imperceptible tightening of his jaw. You disagree, Mr. Corin? His gaze flickered to Governor Farr, before returning to Celine. The surveys capture what people are willing to say to uniformed UFPC officers. What they whisper in the markets may be different. Elias has a tendency toward pessimism, Governor Farr interjected with forced lightness. A remnant of his former position, perhaps. Not pessimism, Elias countered. Realism. 20 years as a syndicate enforcer taught me that what people say and what they believe rarely align. Celine's interest sharpened. Then what do they believe, in your assessment? They believe what the syndicate taught them for generations, that without strict hierarchy, chaos follows. His expression remained neutral, but his words carried weight. They may cheer liberation today, but what happens when they must choose their own paths tomorrow? That's precisely why we're here, Celine replied, conviction warming her voice. To show them that self-determination is not only possible but preferable. A noble goal, Elias conceded. I hope you're right. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of briefings and introductions. Celine met with UFPC department heads, reviewed infrastructure projects, and studied the demographic distribution of the 5 former castes: enforcers, artisans, laborers, servants, and the casteless. She learned of the successful dismantling of syndicate surveillance systems, the reallocation of resources previously monopolized by the elite, and the establishment of civilian oversight committees. Everything seemed to support Governor Farr's assessment. Ardanis embraced freedom. A model transition was underway. That evening, alone in her assigned quarters, Celine drafted her initial report to UFPC High Command. Her fingers hovered over the datapad as she considered Elias's words. After a moment's hesitation, she included a brief note. While official metrics indicate strong progress, there are suggestions that cultural adaptation may require more nuanced approaches. We'll investigate further. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere between Governor Farr's optimism and Elias Corin's caution. Tomorrow's council meeting would perhaps offer greater clarity. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams filled with broken chains that somehow reformed in the darkness. The Grand Rotunda, once the exclusive domain of syndicate officials, now served as the meeting place for Ardanis's Provisional Council. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the circular chamber where representatives from all former castes gathered around a table designed to emphasize equality. No head, no foot, simply a continuous ring. Celine arrived early, observing as council members filtered in. She noticed immediately the subtle separation. Former enforcers and artisans clustered together, while laborers and servants formed their own groups. The few casteless representatives stood awkwardly apart, still uncomfortable in a space that had once been forbidden to them. Governor Farr called the meeting to order, introducing Celine with a flourish that emphasized the Federation's commitment to Ardanis's future. The council members offered polite applause, their expressions ranging from genuine enthusiasm to careful neutrality. The agenda proceeded methodically. Updates on infrastructure repairs, food distribution logistics, educational initiatives. Participation was uneven. Former elite caste members spoke confidently, while those from lower castes often remained silent unless directly addressed. Midway through the session, a slender woman with intense eyes and close-cropped silver hair raised her hand. I wish to address the council regarding the new educational curriculum. The floor recognizes Maris Aloth, Governor Farr announced. Maris stood. her posture emanating authority despite her plain attire, marking her former laborer status. The proposed curriculum fails to adequately address our history under syndicate rule. If we do not teach our children the full truth of oppression, how can we expect them to value freedom? A murmur rippled through the chamber. An elderly man in the ornate vest of the artisan caste rose in response. Educator Eloth speaks of truth, but what of stability? Our children need structure, clear guidelines. This curriculum removes the moral frameworks that have guided generations. Moral frameworks? Maris's voice sharpened. You mean the lies that justified keeping some of us in chains while others prospered? Order, another council member interjected, is not the same as oppression. The syndicate's methods were cruel, yes, but there was clarity in knowing one's place, one's purpose. The debate intensified, revealing fault lines deeper than Celine had anticipated. What struck her was not just the content of the arguments, but their underlying tenor, an unmistakable current of uncertainty about freedom itself. When the session concluded, Celine approached Maris Eloth, who was gathering her materials. That was a passionate argument you made. Maris looked up, her expression guarded. Commander Morrow, I hope you weren't misled by the civility of today's proceedings. Beneath the surface, Ardanis is far from unified. So I observed. You seem to have strong support among the younger council members. The young always adapt more readily to change, Maris replied. It's the elders who cling to the familiar, even when the familiar was a boot on their neck. She hesitated, then added in a lower voice. Be wary of those who speak of order and structure. Some would readily trade their new freedom for the comfort of their old chains. Before Celine could respond, Elias appeared at her side. Commander, Governor Farr requested that I show you the city's eastern district this afternoon. The reconstruction efforts there might interest you. Celine nodded, noting the tension between Elias and Maris. I'd be grateful for the tour, Ms. Eloth. I hope we can continue our conversation soon. Of course. Maris's smile was tight. Just remember, Commander, not everyone who smiles at you wishes your mission success. The Eastern District revealed a Velsara, far removed from the relative order of the administrative center. Here, the scars of liberation were raw, collapsed buildings, makeshift shelters, and citizens who regarded the UFPC ground transport with expressions ranging from hope to outright suspicion. This was primarily a laborer and servant district, Elias explained, as they navigated the narrow streets. The syndicate concentrated industrial operations here, minimal investment in infrastructure. Celine observed a group of workers clearing rubble from what appeared to be a former factory. What was manufactured here? Component parts for syndicate vessels. Elias's voice held no inflection. 16-hour shifts, minimal safety protocols. Accidents were frequent. And you enforced those conditions, Celine stated, watching his reaction. Elias met her gaze evenly. Yes, I did what the system required of me. And now? Now I try to help build something better. He gestured toward a recently established marketplace, where citizens traded goods under UFPC supervision. But I do so understanding what these people have endured, and what they fear. Which is? Uncertainty. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Under the syndicate, life was brutal but predictable. Your caste determined everything, your work, your housing, your mate, your future. Cruel as it was, people knew where they stood. Celine frowned. Surely the ability to choose one's own path is preferable to even the most predictable servitude. To you, perhaps. To me, even. But for many Ardanans, especially those who have known nothing else for generations? Elias shook his head. Choice feels like standing on the edge of an abyss. As they continued their tour, Celine noticed something she hadn't seen from the transport. Graffiti in the shadows of alleyways. angular symbols in faded red, partially obscured, but still legible. Order in chains. Syndicate loyalists? She asked, pointing to the markings. Not exactly. Elias's expression darkened. Something potentially more concerning. These aren't official syndicate glyphs. They're a new variation. Someone is adapting the old ideology to current circumstances. How widespread is this? More than Governor Farr would like to admit. He led her down another street, revealing more graffiti. Choice only breeds chaos. These messages appeared recent, the paint still vibrant. A chill ran through Celine despite the warm afternoon. Who's behind this? That's what concerns me. It's not coming from former syndicate officials hiding in the shadows. It's emerging organically among ordinary citizens. Elias gestured to a nearby building where UFPC personnel distributed supplies to a queue of Ardanans. They accept your aid. They thank you for breaking their chains. But when night falls, some begin to question whether freedom is worth the disorder it brings. Celine processed this information, reconciling it with the optimistic reports she'd reviewed. Governor Farr's briefings didn't mention any organized resistance. Because it isn't organized. Not yet. Elias's tone was matter-of-fact. But sentiment is shifting. You should know that attendance at council meetings has been declining. Former caste leaders are beginning to meet separately, discussing what they call the hollow promise of freedom. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion ahead, raised voices, the shuffle of bodies. They rounded a corner to find a small crowd gathered outside a distribution center. Two groups faced each other. Younger Ardanans in simple clothing arguing with older citizens wearing remnants of caste-specific attire. "What's happening?" Celine asked a nearby UFPC officer. "Dispute over resource allocation," the officer replied. The younger group wants equal distribution regardless of former caste. The traditionalists argue that specialized artisans should receive priority for certain supplies due to their greater contribution to rebuilding. As they watched, the argument intensified. A young woman stepped forward, her voice rising above the others. "The syndicate is gone. We are equals now. No caste deserves preference." An older man with the distinctive collar of the artisan caste responded, "Equality doesn't mean ignoring expertise. Society needs structure, organization, without hierarchies. How do we determine who does what?" "We choose," the young woman countered. "We decide our own paths." "And if everyone chooses wrong?" The older man's question hung in the air. "If all choose to be administrators and none to clean waste ducts, what then?" The UFPC officer moved to intervene, urging calm and promising that all concerns would be addressed through proper channels. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd dispersed, but the tension remained palpable. "You see," Elias said quietly, as they resumed walking. "The questions are beginning. When people have never had to choose, being told they must can feel like abandonment, rather than liberation." That evening, Celine sat alone in her quarters, reviewing the day's observations. Her initial impression of a smooth transition had been superficial. Beneath Ardanas's grateful exterior lay currents of uncertainty and fear that Governor Farr's reports had failed to capture. She opened her personal log and began to record. "Freedom, I've always believed, would be greeted as a dawn. Now I see it may be a storm. The Ardanans' gratitude appears genuine, but so does their apprehension. We've broken their physical chains, but have we prepared them for the weight of choice?" Over the following weeks, Celine immersed herself in Ardanas's complex reality, venturing beyond official briefings and supervised tours. She dispatched surveys to remote caste villages, conducted informal interviews in marketplaces, and initiated evening excursions into lower caste districts, often without the UFPC escort that Governor Farr insisted was necessary. The picture that emerged troubled her deeply. While public squares echoed with liberation slogans and murals celebrating freedom appeared throughout the city, The reports from outlying areas told a different story. Villages were returning UFPC relief supplies, claiming the teams disrespected caste traditions. Remote communities expressed preference for syndicate-appointed magistrates over UFPC administrators, citing familiarity with the old system. One evening, as Celine reviewed these contradictory findings, a knock at her door revealed Elias Koran, his expression grave. "I apologize for the late hour," he said, "but there's something you should see." He led her through back corridors and service tunnels until they reached a nondescript building in the city's industrial sector. Inside, they climbed to an upper floor that offered a view of a vast open space below. There, gathered in the shadows, were dozens of Ardanans from various former castes, arranged in a circle that mimicked the hierarchy of syndicate assemblies, enforcers in the center, radiating outward to the casteless at the margins. "What is this?" Celine whispered. "They call themselves the Orderbound," Elias replied softly. "Not syndicate loyalists exactly, but advocates for a return to structured society. They believe the UFPC's democratic vision will lead to collapse." A speaker addressed the gathering, his voice carrying clearly to their hiding place. "The Federation breaks our chains and calls it kindness. But what has followed? Confusion, conflict, communities without direction. They dismantled the system, but offered no true replacement. Freedom without framework is not liberty. It is abandonment." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. "We thank them for removing the syndicate's cruelty," the speaker continued. "But we need not adopt their chaotic ways. We can forge a new path, one that preserves order while eliminating the worst abuses of the past." The crowd's response was fervent, unified. Celine felt a chill at the passion in their voices, not the fiery rebellion she had been trained to recognize, but something more insidious, a quiet, determined rejection of the very freedom she had come to bestow. "How many such gatherings occur?" she asked, as Elias led her away. "More each week. They're careful, disciplined. No direct opposition to UFPC. No violence. Simply an alternative vision gaining support." He paused. "Governor Farr knows, but she considers it a minor concern, a temporary reaction to change. And you?" His eyes met hers, unblinking. "I think they represent what many Ardanans feel, but won't say openly. The desire for structure is deeply ingrained in our society." "Our?" Elias's expression remained neutral. "I am Ardanan, Commander. Whatever my past role, this is my world." Back in her quarters, Celine updated her log. The challenge is not just rebuilding infrastructure or establishing democratic processes. It is addressing a fundamental question. What if a people, freed from oppression, do not desire the freedom we offer? What if they thank us for breaking their chains, but then forge new ones of their own design? The following days brought further evidence of Ardanas's deepening divide. In the capital's public spaces, a movement calling itself the Freedom Coalition emerged in direct opposition to the Orderbound. Led by Maris Eloth, these predominantly younger Ardanans advocated for rapid democratization, open markets, and complete decentralization of power. The Provisional Council, once a model of collaborative governance, became gridlocked as representatives aligned with either faction. Freedom Coalition members pushed for immediate elections, while Orderbound supporters demanded a charter of guaranteed roles before any franchise was extended. Governor Farr grew increasingly frustrated as her carefully orchestrated transition faltered. "These factions are undermining months of progress," she complained during an emergency staff meeting. "The Freedom Coalition organizes sit-ins that disrupt distribution centers, while the Orderbound spreads dissent in the outer districts. Perhaps we should acknowledge that both groups represent legitimate perspectives," Celine suggested. "Rather than dismissing them as disruptions, we could facilitate dialogue between their leaders." "Legitimize those who reject our mission?" Governor Farr's tone was incredulous. The Order-bound practically venerates the Syndicate era. They reject the Syndicate's cruelty, not its structure, Celine clarified. And the Freedom Coalition seeks the same ultimate goal as the UFPC. They simply want it implemented more rapidly. Commander Morrow is right, interjected Jaraves, a veteran peacekeeper who had become Celine's trusted advisor. Suppressing either movement will only strengthen their resolve. Better to bring them into the open, under our observation. Governor Farr reluctantly agreed to a public forum where both factions could present their visions for Ardanis's future. The event was scheduled for the following week in the Grand Rotunda, with UFPC officials moderating to ensure civil discourse. As preparations for the forum progressed, Celine sought out Elias, who had been notably absent from recent meetings. She found him in the Eastern District, observing reconstruction efforts from a distance. The forum will need order-bound representation, she said without preamble. Someone articulate, respected, who understands both perspectives. Elias continued watching the workers. You want me to speak for them? You understand their concerns better than anyone in the UFPC, and despite your past, you've demonstrated commitment to a better future for Ardanis. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. And if my better future doesn't align with the Federation's vision? Then articulate that difference honestly, Celine replied. This isn't about manufacturing consensus. It's about understanding what Ardanans truly want. Elias studied her for a long moment. You surprise me, Commander. Most UFPC officials believe they already know what's best for worlds they've never lived on. I'm learning that liberation is more complex than breaking physical chains. She met his gaze directly. Will you speak at the forum? Not as an official representative of the Order-bound, he cautioned. They would reject any UFPC appointment, but I will present their perspective as I understand it. That's all I ask. The day of the forum arrived amid rising tensions. The Grand Rotunda filled beyond capacity, with citizens from all former castes crowding the chamber. UFPC peacekeepers maintained a visible but restrained presence, their blue uniforms stark against the varied attire of the Ardanans. Governor Farr opened the proceedings with a plea for mutual respect and constructive dialogue. Maris Eloth spoke first for the Freedom Coalition, her voice resonant with conviction as she outlined a vision of Ardanis freed not only from syndicate control, but from all hierarchical constraints. For generations, we were told our worth was determined by the caste of our birth, she declared. Now, we have the opportunity to build a society where each person determines their own value through their choices, their contributions, their dreams. Why would we recreate any system that limits that potential? Her supporters erupted in applause, while others in the chamber remained pointedly silent. When Elias took the podium, the contrast was immediate. Where Maris had been passionate, he was measured. Where she had been idealistic, he was pragmatic. I stand before you as someone who once enforced the very system we have overthrown, he began, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. I witnessed its cruelties firsthand, and I do not advocate its return. He paused, scanning the audience. But I also understand what many Ardanans now fear. The Syndicate, for all its evils, provided certainty. Each person knew their role, their place, their future. That certainty had a value that those who have always known freedom may not comprehend. Murmurs of agreement rippled through sections of the crowd. The question before us is not whether to return to oppression. None wish that. The question is whether we discard all structure in our pursuit of liberty. Elias's gaze found Celine among the UFPC officials. Chains can bind, yes, but they can also support. They can connect. They can provide the framework upon which a society builds itself. The tension in the chamber intensified as he continued, articulating the order-bound philosophy with a clarity that even its opponents could not dismiss. He spoke of the need for guided transition rather than abrupt transformation, of the value of social roles even without syndicate enforcement, of the possibility of a third path between tyranny and chaos. As the forum progressed to open discussion, the division among Ardanans became increasingly evident. The debate grew heated, with accusations of syndicate sympathy countered by claims of naive utopianism. Beneath the substantive arguments lay a fundamental question that neither faction fully addressed. What defined Ardanan identity now that the syndicate no longer dictated it? The session concluded without resolution, but Celine considered it a qualified success. The factions had articulated their positions publicly, peacefully, and the broader population had witnessed the complexity of the challenges ahead. That evening, as she prepared her report for UFPC High Command, a priority message arrived from Governor Farr. Surveillance detected communications between order-bound leaders and suspected syndicate remnants in neighboring systems. Investigating financial connections. Forum may have been strategic distraction. Celine stared at the message, recalling Elias's measured words, the thoughtful reactions of many attendees. Could the movement's growth be attributed to external manipulation rather than genuine sentiment? The implication troubled her deeply. She sought out Jaraves, finding the veteran peacekeeper in the command center reviewing security footage. "Have you seen this?" Celine asked, displaying Governor Farr's message. Jara's expression remained neutral. "I've seen the report that prompted it. The evidence is circumstantial at best. You don't believe there's syndicate involvement. I believe Governor Farr is looking for simple explanations to complex problems." Jara shut down the display she'd been monitoring. It's easier to blame outside agitators than to acknowledge that our liberation model might not fit every world. Celine lowered her voice. "You think the order-bound represents genuine Ardanan sentiment?" "I think many Ardanans are genuinely uncertain about what freedom means for them." Jara's weathered features softened slightly. "We come from worlds where individual choice is celebrated, where autonomy is the highest value. But that's not universal. Some cultures prize collective harmony over personal liberty. So we should abandon our mission? Allow them to recreate the very hierarchies that oppress them?" "No." Jara's response was firm. "But we should perhaps reconsider our timeline, our methods. Liberation isn't just about removing the oppressor. It's about building capacity for self-determination. That takes time, patience." Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent alert. Protests had erupted in the Triangle Commons, where Freedom Coalition supporters were staging a sit-in at the Central Archives. Order-bound counter-protesters had surrounded them, and tensions were escalating rapidly. By the time Celine arrived with a contingent of peacekeepers, the situation was approaching crisis. Hundreds of Ardanans faced each other across the plaza, their chants echoing off stone facades. Choice and freedom countered by order and purpose. Maris Eloth stood at the center of the Freedom Coalition group, her voice amplified as she addressed both her supporters and the order-bound opposition. "You claim to want order, but what you really fear is responsibility. The responsibility to shape your own destiny." An order-bound speaker responded with equal fervor. "You confuse structure with oppression. Without shared understanding of our roles, how can society function? Your freedom is a path to dissolution." As the exchange grew more heated, Celine deployed her peacekeepers in a loose perimeter, instructed to maintain distance unless violence erupted. She spotted Elias at the edge of the order-bound group, observing rather than participating, his expression troubled. Pushing through the crowd, she reached him. "This is spiraling beyond dialogue," she said urgently. "If you have influence with them, now is the time to use it." Elias's gaze remained on the confrontation. "What would you have me tell them? To embrace a freedom they don't understand? To trust institutions they've never experienced? To avoid violence that will set back both causes?" Celine replied. "Neither side wins if this deteriorates." A moment of tension hung between them before Elias nodded. "I'll speak to their leaders. But this is merely delaying the inevitable confrontation. Commander, Ardanis must choose its path, and that choice may not align with Federation expectations. Through combined efforts, Elias calming the order-bound faction, Maris reluctantly dispersing her supporters, and UFPC peacekeepers maintaining separation, the immediate crisis was averted. But as the crowds slowly dissipated, the underlying tension remained unresolved. That night, mysterious signals jammed the Provisional Council's radio broadcasts, replacing them with Syndicate-era propaganda. Freedom without chain is chaos. The technical signature matched old Syndicate protocols, confirming Governor Farr's suspicions of external interference. The following days brought further escalation. Aid convoys bound for remote villages returned untouched, their drivers reporting that villagers claimed the relief teams insulted caste traditions. Markets that had reopened under UFPC supervision now stood half-empty as vendors withdrew, citing uncertainty about new commercial regulations. Then came the incident that transformed simmering tension into open crisis. Maris Eloth was arrested under suspicion of inciting sedition after intelligence suggested the Freedom Coalition was planning to forcibly occupy government buildings. Celine learned of the arrest only after it had occurred, Governor Farr having authorized the operation without consulting her. She found the governor in the secure command center, reviewing surveillance footage. "This exceeds your authority," Celine stated, her tone cold. "Any detention of political figures should have been coordinated with my office." Governor Farr didn't look up from the display. "We had credible intelligence of imminent action. The situation required immediate response." "What intelligence?" Celine demanded. "Show me." Reluctantly, Governor Farr transferred a file to Celine's datapad. Intercepted communications, fragments of planning documents, statements from informants. Reviewing it quickly, Celine identified critical gaps. "This is circumstantial at best. Nothing here justifies detention without formal charges." "The Federation granted me discretion to maintain order during transition," Governor Farr countered. "The Freedom Coalition has grown increasingly radical under Eloth's leadership." "Radical. They advocate for exactly what the UFPC claims to support: democracy, self-determination, equality. They advocate for immediate implementation without consideration for Ardanis's unique circumstances." Governor Farr's frustration was evident. Their confrontational approach is exacerbating divisions, providing the order-bound with recruitment opportunities. Celine maintained her composure with effort. "Release her. Now. Before this becomes a rallying point that neither of us can control." For a tense moment, it seemed Governor Farr might refuse. Then, with visible reluctance, she issued the order. "But she remains under surveillance, and any further indications of seditious activity will result in immediate redetention." The damage, however, was already done. News of Maris's arrest spread rapidly, igniting outrage among Freedom Coalition supporters. By the time of her release, 6 hours later, demonstrations had erupted throughout Velsara, with young Ardanans chanting anti-UFPC slogans alongside calls for immediate elections. The order-bound seized the opportunity to position themselves as moderates, issuing statements condemning both the UFPC's heavy-handed tactics and the coalition's dangerous provocations. Their membership swelled as citizens seeking stability in increasingly chaotic circumstances found their message of ordered liberty increasingly appealing. Celine's personal log that evening reflected her growing disillusionment. "We came to liberate, but increasingly, I wonder if we simply replaced one form of control with another. The Syndicate ruled through force. We rule through the assumption that our values are universal. Both approaches deny Ardanans the agency we claim to champion." In a desperate attempt to defuse the escalating crisis, Celine proposed a planet-wide referendum. Citizens would vote yes for immediate universal elections or no to delay until a comprehensive social charter could be ratified. The proposal, received reluctant support from both factions. The Freedom Coalition confident in popular desire for democracy. The Order-bound certain that most Ardannans preferred structured transition. Governor Farr opposed the plan, arguing that Ardanis wasn't ready for such a momentous decision. But UFPC High Command, concerned by reports of deteriorating conditions, overruled her objections. The referendum was scheduled for the following week, with UFPC personnel overseeing polling stations throughout the planet. As preparations for the vote intensified, Celine found herself increasingly isolated. Governor Farr maintained frigid formality, clearly resentful of the referendum decision. Maris Eloth, though grateful for Celine's role in securing her release, remained suspicious of UFPC intentions. And Elias Corin had withdrawn almost entirely. His occasional appearances at official functions, marked by guarded courtesy, but little substantive engagement. 3 days before the referendum, Celine ventured into the city alone, disguising her UFPC affiliation with civilian clothing. She moved through markets and residential areas, listening to ordinary conversations, observing the pulse of the city beyond official reports and factional rhetoric. What she witnessed troubled her deeply. The vibrant energy that had characterized Velsara in the weeks after liberation had diminished, replaced by a wary alertness. Citizens spoke in lowered voices, glancing over shoulders. Murals celebrating freedom had been defaced, overlaid with order-bound symbols, unbroken chains forming perfect circles. In a small tea house in the artisan quarter, she overheard an elderly woman speaking to a group of younger listeners. The syndicate was cruel, yes, but we knew where we stood. Now, we drift without anchor. These off-worlders tell us to choose. But what if we choose wrongly? What if our choices harm the whole? A young man responded passionately. Better to make our own mistakes than to live by another's command. The chains are broken. Why would we forge new ones? The old woman's reply was soft but clear. Because without structure, we are not a society. We are merely individuals colliding, like dust in the wind. That night, unable to sleep, Celine left the UFPC compound again, drawn to the city's northern district where former enforcers had established a quasi-autonomous community. As she approached the area, a figure emerged from the shadows, Elias Corin, his expression grim. "You shouldn't be here," he said without greeting. "This district isn't safe for UFPC personnel, especially alone." "I'm not here as UFPC. I'm here to understand." She studied his face in the dim streetlight. "You've distanced yourself from the transition effort." "I've been preoccupied." His tone revealed nothing. "With the order-bound," Celine stated. It wasn't a question. Elias didn't deny it. They needed guidance. Without it, their movement might have turned violent weeks ago. "So you're their leader now." "I'm a voice of moderation in a group that could easily embrace extremism." He gestured for her to walk with him, away from the enforcer district. The referendum has heightened tensions. Many see it as their last opportunity to preserve what they value of the old ways. They move through quiet streets, their conversation protected by the ambient noise of the city. Celine sensed a shift in Elias, a resolution that hadn't been present before, as if he had finally chosen his path after weeks of ambivalence. "The order-bound will accept the referendum results?" she asked. "If the process is fair, yes." He paused. "But you should know that I believe the outcome will surprise you. The Freedom Coalition has vocal support in the capital, but throughout the outer regions, the desire for structure remains strong. And if the vote favors immediate democracy, then we will adapt." His voice held a hint of steel. "But we will continue to advocate for a society that balances liberty with order, even if that means opposing UFPC directives." They reached a small plaza where a statue of a syndicate official had been toppled during the liberation. In its place stood a temporary marker, a broken chain rising from a marble base. Someone had recently painted a circle around the chain in order-bound red. "Your movement modified the UFPC symbol," Celine observed. A deliberate message? The circle represents continuity, community. The chain, broken or whole, represents connection. Elias turned to face her directly. We don't reject freedom, Commander. We simply understand that true freedom exists within frameworks, not in their absence. Celine considered his words, finding in them an echo of her own evolving thoughts. I entered this mission believing that liberty was a universal aspiration, that once freed from oppression, all people would embrace self-determination as we understand it. I'm no longer certain of that. That uncertainty is progress, Elias replied. Perhaps the greatest gift the UFPC could offer Ardanis is not your model of freedom, but the space to define our own. As dawn broke on referendum day, Velsara hummed with anticipation. Polling stations opened across the city under UFPC supervision, with representatives from both factions present as observers. The early hours proceeded smoothly, with high turnout and minimal disruption. Celine monitored reports from the command center, cautiously optimistic that the vote might proceed without the violence that had seemed increasingly inevitable. Governor Farr remained skeptical, deploying additional security to key locations despite Celine's concern that such measures might be perceived as intimidation. By midday, the first incidents occurred. In the Northern District, Freedom Coalition volunteers reported harassment by masked individuals wearing order-bound colors. In the Artisan Quarter, a polling station temporarily closed after a verbal altercation escalated to pushing and shoving. Still, these remained isolated events, quickly contained by UFPC peacekeepers. As afternoon faded into evening, however, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Reports arrived of ballot boxes seized and burned in outlying districts. Confirmation came that order-bound supporters had established checkpoints on roads leading to polling stations in former laborer communities, turning away voters they identified as coalition sympathizers. Celine dispatched peacekeeping units to the most volatile areas, instructing them to secure voting access without escalating tensions. She attempted to contact Elias, hoping he might exert influence over order-bound militants, but he was unreachable. At the Grand Pavilion, where final tallies would be announced, Celine found a tense standoff already in progress. Hundreds of citizens from both factions had gathered, separated by a thin line of UFPC personnel. The air vibrated with competing chants, the mood electric with anticipation and suspicion. As darkness fell, preliminary results began to arrive from secured polling stations. The pattern was immediately clear, and for Celine, profoundly unsettling. Across all regions, the vote was trending heavily toward no, rejecting immediate democracy in favor of a structured social charter. In the command center, Governor Farr reviewed the data with poorly concealed satisfaction. It appears the citizens of Ardanis aren't as eager for unconstrained freedom as your idealist believed. Celine ignored the provocation, focusing instead on reports of increasing disturbances throughout the city. We need to delay the final announcement until we can verify results from all districts. There are too many irregularities, too many stations compromised. And give the Freedom Coalition time to manufacture challenges? No. Governor Farr's tone was resolute. The trend is clear. We announce at midnight as scheduled. Before Celine could argue further, an urgent alert diverted their attention. A major confrontation had erupted at the Triangle Commons, where Freedom Coalition supporters had gathered to protest alleged voting irregularities. Order-bound counter-protesters had surrounded them, and violence appeared imminent. Celine rushed to the scene with all available peacekeepers, arriving to find chaos. The orderly demonstration had devolved into a melee, with stones and makeshift weapons flying between factions. UFPC officers struggled to establish a buffer zone, their calls for calm drowned by angry shouts. In the center of the square, Celine spotted Maris Eloth, attempting to restore order among her supporters. On the opposite side, To her surprise, stood Elias, similarly engaged with order-bound militants. Their eyes met across the turbulent space. Recognition, shared dismay, mutual understanding that events had slipped beyond their control. A sharp crack split the air, a sound Celine recognized instantly as weapons fire. The crowd froze momentarily, then erupted in panic. Through the surging bodies, Celine glimpsed a young person crumpling to the ground, blood spreading across their Freedom Coalition banner. "Medic!" she shouted, fighting her way toward the fallen protester. By the time she reached them, it was clear no medical intervention would help. The young Ardanan, barely more than a child, stared sightlessly at the night sky, their features frozen in permanent surprise. A shout from nearby, "Order-bound assassin!" The accusation ignited fury among coalition supporters, who surged toward their opposition with renewed violence. UFPC peacekeepers formed a defensive line, but they were outnumbered, their non-lethal weapons insufficient against the tide of rage. Celine found herself separated from her unit, surrounded by the chaos of battle. A building at the edge of the square had caught fire, its flames casting monstrous shadows across the fighting. Through smoke and confusion, she glimpsed civilians trapped in a market stall as the blaze spread. Without hesitation, she abandoned the perimeter, charging toward the endangered bystanders. The heat intensified as she approached, searing her lungs with each breath. The trapped civilians, an elderly couple and a child, cowered behind a counter as flames consumed the fabric awning above them. "This way!" Celine called, extending her hand. The child moved first, then the old woman, but the man hesitated, fear paralyzing him as a burning beam crashed nearby. Celine lunged forward, seizing his arm, pulling him forcibly from his shelter just as the structure collapsed. They stumbled together through smoke and debris, emerging into the relative clarity of an adjacent alley where the others waited. "Thank you," the old woman whispered, clutching the child close. "We thought—" She broke off, staring past Celine with widening eyes. Celine turned to find Elias Corin approaching, his clothing torn, a cut bleeding freely above his eye. Behind him, the square remained a battlefield, punctuated by the sharp commands of UFPC officers and the crash of breaking glass. "Get them to the eastern safe zone," Elias said without preamble. "The fighting is spreading toward the central districts." Celine hesitated, torn between her duty to these civilians and her responsibility to her peacekeeping units. Elias seemed to read her thoughts. "I'll find your officers. Direct them to regroup at the Grand Pavilion," he promised. "These people need immediate evacuation." Decision made. Celine guided the small group through back streets, toward the designated safe zone, a former school building now staffed by UFPC medical personnel. As they walked, distant explosions illuminated the sky, evidence that the violence had escalated beyond simple protest. After delivering the civilians to safety, Celine made her way toward the Grand Pavilion, where the referendum results were scheduled to be announced, despite the chaos engulfing the city. The streets had emptied of ordinary citizens, replaced by roving groups of factional militants and scattered UFPC patrols attempting to maintain order. The pavilion itself was eerily quiet when she arrived, its grand entrance guarded by a reinforced UFPC detachment. Inside, Governor Farr stood with senior staff before a communications array, preparing to broadcast the final tally. "This is madness," Celine declared, entering the chamber. "The city is in flames. Any announcement now will only fuel the violence." Governor Farr's expression was stone. "Delaying will be interpreted as manipulation. The results are clear. 78% reject immediate democracy. The people have spoken." "The people are killing each other in the streets," Celine's control finally broke. "This isn't the model transition you've been reporting to high command. It's a catastrophic failure of our approach." "The failure," Governor Farr replied coldly, "lies with those who refuse to accept that Ardanis might choose a different path than the one we prescribed." Before Celine could respond, The chamber doors opened again to admit Elias Karan. Blood had dried on his face, and his movements betrayed exhaustion, but his eyes remained alert, evaluative. "The coalition forces are retreating to the Eastern District," he reported, without waiting for acknowledgement. "Order-bound militants have established control over the central and northern sectors. UFPC units are isolated, unable to coordinate effectively." Governor Farr regarded him with suspicion. "And your role in this, Mr. Koren?" "Reports indicate order-bound leadership orchestrated today's violence." "I've spent the past hours trying to prevent a massacre," Elias replied evenly. "But yes, elements within the order-bound initiated the confrontation. They believed the referendum would be manipulated to favor the coalition." His gaze shifted to Celine. "The situation has deteriorated beyond peaceful resolution. The order-bound is establishing an interim council of order in the former syndicate headquarters. Former officials are being recalled as advisors. Coalition leaders are being detained or driven into exile." The implications struck Celine with physical force. In a single night, months of careful liberation work had unraveled. Ardanis was sliding back toward the very system the UFPC had dismantled. Perhaps without the syndicate's overt cruelty, but with its fundamental structure intact. "And you support this?" she asked Elias, searching his face for the man who had spoken of balancing order with liberty. "I support Ardanis finding its own path." Weariness tinged his voice. "This is not the outcome I hoped for, but it may be the one we needed." "Needed?" The word tasted bitter. "A return to hierarchy? To predetermined roles based on birth? Not identical to the past. No, but a recognition that our society requires structure to function." Elias stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You fought for our freedom to choose. Commander, this is our choice. Imperfect, perhaps even wrong by your standards, but ours." In that moment, standing amid the wreckage of her mission, Celine finally understood the fundamental miscalculation that had doomed the UFPC's efforts on Ardanis. They had equated liberation with the imposition of their own values, never considering that freedom might express itself in forms they found regressive or incomprehensible. The days that followed confirmed the collapse of the UFPC's vision for Ardanis. Curfews were imposed throughout Velsara as order-bound forces consolidated control. The Provisional Council dissolved itself under threat, replaced by the self-appointed Council of Order with Elias Koren as its reluctant public face. UFPC peacekeepers withdrew to secure zones, their authority now limited to protecting Federation personnel and facilities. Freedom Coalition leaders who escaped detention fled to remote regions or off-world, their movement fragmented, but not entirely extinguished. 1 week after the failed referendum, Celine received orders from UFPC High Command. All Federation personnel would evacuate Ardanis within 48 hours. The liberation mission was officially classified as indeterminate, a bureaucratic euphemism for failure. In her final days on the planet, Celine compiled a comprehensive dossier of personal testimonies from Ardanans across all former castes. She recorded the words of artisans who missed the guaranteed guild assignments of the syndicate era, scholars who described democracy as feeling like being lost at sea, and children who expressed confusion about their place in a world without clear boundaries. Her final dispatch to UFPC High Command articulated the lessons she had painfully extracted from the mission's collapse. "We fought for freedom, and they thanked us for the familiarity of their chains. Our fundamental error was assuming that liberty, as we define it, represents a universal aspiration. On Ardanis, we discovered that for some, security within structure outweighs the uncertain promise of self-determination." The evacuation proceeded with methodical efficiency. UFPC equipment was dismantled, records secured, personnel processed for departure. Throughout Velsara, the symbols of liberation, broken chains, star circle emblems, freedom murals, were systematically removed. replaced by the order-bound insignia of an unbroken chain, forming a perfect circle. On the eve of her departure, as Celine completed her personal preparations, a message arrived requesting her presence at the former governor's palace. She found Elias, waiting in a chamber that still bore the marks of hasty renovation. UFPC communication panels half dismantled. Order-bound banners not yet hung. "I wanted to see you before you left," he said simply. Celine noted the formal attire he now wore. Not syndicate regalia, but something reminiscent of it. Structured, hierarchical. A visual representation of the order he had chosen to embrace. "Is this outcome what you intended from the beginning?" she asked. The question that had haunted her through sleepless nights. "No." His answer came without hesitation. "I believed in the possibility of a middle path, a society that preserved structure while eliminating oppression." A shadow crossed his features. "Perhaps that remains possible, in time. But not yet. Not while the memory of chaos is so fresh. And the Freedom Coalition, those who genuinely wanted the liberty we offered, they will be permitted to exist, under supervision. Their voices are necessary, even if their vision cannot be fully realized now." He approached her, extending a hand that held a small object, a fragment of an old syndicate ledger, its edges worn smooth. "What is this?" Celine asked, accepting the offering. "A reminder," Elias replied, "of what was, what might have been, what may still be." His expression softened slightly. "Perhaps, one day, we will find a way to balance order and freedom. But today, we choose the known." Celine studied the fragment, recognizing entries that assigned individuals to castes, roles, futures, an artifact of the very system she had come to dismantle. Yet in its faded ink and precise notation, she saw not just oppression, but the framework of a society that had functioned, however imperfectly, for generations. "I hope your Council of Order remembers the distinction between structure and subjugation," she said finally. "And I hope the Federation learns that liberation requires more than breaking chains." Elias's response held no rancor, only weary wisdom. "It requires understanding what binds a people together, even when those bonds seem incomprehensible to outsiders." They parted without further words, both aware that their brief alliance had altered them in ways neither had anticipated. Celine carried the ledger fragment with her as she boarded the UFPC shuttle the following morning, tucking it into her personal log as a tangible reminder of Ardanis's complex legacy. As the shuttle lifted off, Vilsara's skyline dimmed under enforced curfew. No banners waved. The earlier murals had been defaced, replaced by new order-bound insignia. From her viewport, Celine glimpsed Elias standing on a balcony of the Provisional Governor's Palace, gazing at the departing vessel. Their eyes met briefly, shared sorrow, mutual understanding, before the planet receded into the starless void. In the quiet of the shuttle cabin, Celine recorded her final log entry. "Freedom isn't always welcome. Some soils cannot bear the seeds we sow. Perhaps in time the soil changes, but for now, the Ardanans have chosen structure over uncertainty. They thanked us for breaking their chains, then forged new ones of their own design. The paradox of liberation, I now understand, lies in respecting a people's right to define freedom in terms we might never comprehend." The stars stretched into luminous streaks as the shuttle entered hyperspace, carrying Celine away from Ardanis and toward a federation that would struggle to understand the lessons she brought home. Behind her, a planet navigated its uncertain future, seeking a balance between the order of the past and the promise of a liberty defined by its own terms.